about biological macromolecules, and specifically we're going to focus on carbs and fats, or carbohydrates and lipids. I just want to make sure it's recording. Yes, it is. I look like a dork. Ready to go. Okay. So we broke this up. I broke this up in the textbook. At the end of chemistry stuff, it goes into sugars, fats, proteins, and nucleic acids. What are nucleic acids? They are acids, like we were talking about pH. They are acids. What are nucleic acids? If you did the reading assignment, that was already before. Yeah?
I think from what I looked at, proteins are made up of that.
No, proteins are not made of nucleic acids. Nucleic acids are the building blocks for our DNA. So our DNA and our RNA are types of nucleotides that make up nucleic acids. So that's the fourth set of biological macromolecules that we're going to talk about at the end. We'll talk about that on Friday. For now, we're going to focus on the first two classes, and that's carbohydrates and lipids. All right, so we're going to talk about monomers and polymers in biology. What's a monosaccharide? What's a disaccharide? Polysaccharides from plant animal sources. Lipids or fats, you can call it either thing. It's all the same for the most part. Lipid is the big category. And then saturated versus unsaturated fats versus trans fats. Good versus bad cholesterol, because this is highly relevant. It's going to come up later again in the course as well. And then steroid hormones and vitamin D. These are actually classified in the lipid category, believe it or not. So things like testosterone, estradiol, those are steroids. Those are considered lipids, okay? Or they're lipid soluble. And then we'll have a little set of application questions in the end, okay? All right, so recap. So this is what I'm going into. Jerusalem asked that question. We're going to just recap where we ended last time because it was a little rushed at the very end. Carbon is able to branch, so there's a lot of branching that happens. There's isomers. Remember, it's the same chemical formula, but they're different chemical structures, so there's a lot of versatility. Double bonds can actually change chain conformation. So carbon structures that have a double bond can actually change their actual functionality and chemical nature. So there's a double bond in two different locations in this particular molecule. We also have unsaturated and saturated fats. Now raise your hand if you've heard of saturated and unsaturated fats. Okay, hopefully, okay, most of us, okay. There's just different types or categories of fats. And in the diet, which one is a little bit healthier, if we had to say the healthier fats? Unsaturated, perfect. Okay, so you already know like the application base of this. Now I want you to know the biology of this. Why? Why would an unsaturated fat be better than a saturated fat? And what it comes to, I'm going to tell you just the kicker right now, is just the double bonds in the hydrocarbon chain. Whether it has double bonds or whether it has no double bonds. And we'll go through the chemistry of what that looks like. We've got ring formation of different carbon molecules, things like benzene, cyclohexane. So carbon can make long, big chains, branching structures with double bonds in them, long tails, like the 3 fatty acid tails in a fat. This is a typical triglyceride that we would find in human adipose cells or fat cells. Carbon can make rings. It's very versatile. Now, recap, chemistry, bonds, covalent bonds. How many covalent shared bonds can carbon atom make? 4. Yes? Remember honk, 1, 2, 3, 4? C is at the end, 4, okay? Because of that, it can handhold and participate in 4 different atom bonds. It can be this ring structure, it can be the branching chain structure. That's why carbon is this essential vital atom of life, or element of life. Okay, so that's a recap. Now we're going to talk about polymers and macromolecules, aka macromolecules, in biology. Monomer subunits, okay, I'm going to erase the recap, because y'all got this. I wish I had a delete button. I could just push delete. Okay. Monomers, have you guys heard of that term ever?
No.
Yes? You've heard it? Okay. Some of you have, some of you haven't. We're going to use it a lot, and in biology and chemistry, we use that a lot. Monomer, monomer. What does that sound like?
One.
One, perfect. One What is myrrh?
Frankincense and.
Frankincense and myrrh spelled differently, but that's funny. Well, I say myrrh is like a thing. It's a unit. It's a thing. This is one thing, okay, or one unit. So one unit or thing, okay? So these are simple. Your body makes these or you eat these. This is the simplest version of what they could be, okay? What is a polymer?
What the many units?
Someone said it.
Many units.
Many units, okay? So this is many things, or many units. In this case, now they're bonded together. Yep, here comes the chemistry again, okay? So we bond them, connect them together. And so these become more complex, bigger, longer, more sophisticated. A lot of what we eat and consume, a lot of it, is our polymers. We eat them, we ingest them, they come into your system, and we break them down into the monomers so that we can metabolize those fully and get energy from the nutrients that you put into your body, okay? We also build these. Once we have monomers, we can use those to build big giant things in your body. Big proteins, red blood cell proteins, muscle fiber proteins, all the cell structures that make up the cells of your body, okay? So these go back and forth, from building to breaking down, all inside of your body and out in the natural world, the things that we eat and we take in. All right, so the examples that we're gonna go over are things like simple sugars. You've heard that before, right? Simple sugars are just monosaccharides. We're gonna look at those. Amino acids and nucleotides. Amino acids are the building blocks for proteins, and we'll look at those next time on Friday. And then nucleotides are the building blocks for life. Is true, actually. That's true. DNA, yes. So nucleotides make up the DNA and the RNA, and that's the blueprint for your entire body that's maintained in every single cell, okay? The polymer version of those are nucleic acids, or when I build these and I construct them together and put them into polymers, I mean, I don't personally, but the cells in my body do, right? Those are the polymers, DNA, RNA, the nucleic acids. When I build the amino acid monomers, and they get constructed into the big giant form, they become proteins, the polymer version. When I take these simple sugars, the monosaccharides, and they get built together in these long chains, they become the polymers of polysaccharides. Multiple saccharides bonded together, or strung together. Does that make sense? Okay. An example here is just showing little individual monomers building this giant protein. It's called a microtubule. I love microtubules. They're in every cell of your body. They're like the train tracks inside yourself that allow all kinds of transport and magic to happen inside of cells. This is the monomer tubulin. This is the polymer microtubule. So your body is just a brilliant piece of machinery. Even at the cellular level, it's breaking down and building constantly. So it's very, very dynamic. So we've got two different reactions you have to know. And these are just in general. They apply to all of these monomers and polymers, building them and breaking them down. So your cells of your body are constantly doing this. Dehydration or condensation reaction, and your text goes over this, exactly how it works, okay? And then we have a hydrolysis reaction, which means hydrolysis. What does hydro mean? Water. What is lysis? That's weird, but you've probably heard it somewhere. Lysis. To lyse. What if you lyse something? It means to break, to tear, to bust apart. If a cell lyses, it's rupturing apart and splitting. If a molecule lyses or undergoes lysis, it's splitting apart. So, water splitting. Dehydration, what happens when you're dehydrated?
Pass out.
That is true, you can pass out. You can even die with severe dehydration, right? But what leads to the dehydration? Lack of water, okay? Lack of water, so removing water, like sweating, and not taking enough in. I've done that many times, not on purpose, just happens. Losing water, taking water away, that actually results in a reaction where you're taking out a water, that's called a dehydration reaction. And in doing so, because the end of this monomer here and the end of this monomer here have a hydroxide or an OH, and they have an H. Remember what's the chemical composition of water? H2O, right? So those are in close proximity. There's an enzyme that helps to make this happen faster. We'll talk about enzymes later. Suffice it to say for now, they get close enough together. Hydrogen jumps onto the OH and they form water. And in doing so, it brings those two molecules together. They now have a new bond that actually links them. Now I have multiple monomers in a row instead of just the floating monomers by themselves. I made a polymer. Okay? Your cells are constantly doing this. Dehydration, if you ever, and I will ask you this on our first exam, some of the basics of chemistry, and these two reactions, dehydration and hydrolysis. Dehydration, just think of when you're dehydrated or to become dehydrated, you lose a water. This reaction pinches off the water, brings the monomers together. So this is the process of how we build polymers, how your cells build polymers. Is that clear? Okay. The other one, hydrolysis. A lot of times I'll catch myself saying things wrong because I kind of learned things phonetically. I would always learn it. I'm very visual and I like to draw and write things down. And so I will learn them just how they sound. And then I get better at it, more familiar, and I say it lots of times and I say it right. But how I used to say this is hydrolysis. Because that would tell me using water to break it up. Hydrolysis is like the fancy science way to say it. But like if you take it apart, the word roots means using water to break it apart. So what reaction do you think that is going to look like? This one is dehydrating, taking out the water. This one is using water to lyse or to break. It's actually the exact opposite. It's a water coming in here. I lost my marker. Water coming in here to bust that apart and break that bond and separate the polymer into monomers. These are exact inverse relationships, these two reactions, and they're always ongoing. Do I need to build stuff up or do I need to break stuff down for the energy? Okay? So here's that reaction, the hydrolysis or the hydrolysis. Water molecule, as long as it's present, you have a big polymer chain. Water actually adds the H and the OH to the two serial positioned monomers, and boom, they split in half. Now they're individual monomers. So we just broke from polymer down to individual monomers by doing that. Okay, so I want you to remember, recap. Dehydration reaction builds polymers. It removes the water, builds polymers. Okay? Hydrolysis reactions break polymers apart into the individual monomers. And this can happen over and over, here, here, here. And that's what your digestion, when you take in nutrients and in your GI tract, that's what's actually happening in those cells. Out inside the lumen of your gut and then when they get into cells. Your enzymes are breaking apart all those bonds. So you can break down those big macromolecules and turn them into the individual monomers, like right here. Okay. Everybody get that? That sort of forms the basis for how our cells go from building and breaking down all these different macromolecules. Okay, this is a silly picture. We just went to the beach and we got Cold Stone and they were just like buggy, all crazy, all excited to have ice cream. We're just like eating with no spoons. And that's my daughter Lola, that's my son Pee Wee. This was a long time ago. Carbs, carbohydrates, it's all the sweet, sugary, yummy stuff. I hate to say it, like I have a sweet tooth for sure. I can't help it. And actually there's a lot of recent studies in the last decade that show the effects of carbohydrates and things specifically like chocolate and even sugars, simple sugars, have effects on the brain that are similar to drugs in the addiction centers of the brain, the pleasure reward pathways of the brain. So there is sort of a component to this that for many people they get very addicted or attached to the sugar flavors or specific carbohydrates. This is just showing this has a lot of fat and a lot of carbs in donuts. Actually, one of the most highly consumed carbohydrates in the U.S., donuts. Nice. Second or third, the pizza. We're going to talk about all these. Yes. Loaded with carbohydrates. Now, it's not carbohydrates are bad. We need carbohydrates. A lot of people are like, oh, just no sugar. Avoid sugar. Do those. You've heard of those low carb, very trendy diets, or like the Atkins diet or the paleo diet. A lot of these just eliminate a lot of carbohydrates, especially processed ones. I would argue, though, and it's based on your physiology, you need carbohydrates. Okay? You need a balance of carbs, proteins, and fats. And we're going to get really into that in our nutrition section and in our nutrition and metabolism lab, which is next week. All right, so simple sugars, monosaccharides. Here's a bunch of them. Do you have to know all these chemical structures? Yes, you do. I'm just kidding. Sorry, that's not funny. You don't have to know all these. If you're taking bio or chem, like upper division, you have to know all these. Not here, I just want you to know sugars, monosaccharides are simple carbohydrates. They're either 3 carbons long, or they're 5 carbons long, or they're 6 carbons long. And these are some examples. 2 that are really, really common in our diet and that are our main fuel for sugar in our bodies are glucose, and we also take in our food and use fructose. There's also galactose and glyceraldehyde, ribose, there's all these other things. But the main one really that we're going to focus on is glucose. Fructose is really an isomer of glucose. They're both 6 carbon sugars, okay? So they're multiples, all sugars. The chemical formula for all carbohydrates is C1H2O1. I know there's always going to be this ratio of same number of carbons and oxygens and double the amount of hydrogens. If you just see a chemical formula and it has that ratio, C1H2O1, you know it's a sugar. You know it's some type of carbohydrate, okay? But you don't have to know all these names and their different structures. There's a lot of energy in the bonds between the carbons. So energy in the bonds between the carbons. So when your cells cut and break these down even into simpler versions and generate energy, there's energy that's released because the high energy content that's in those tight carbon bonds of the carbohydrates. Sugars naturally form rings in aqueous solutions like water. So this is glucose, the common glucose. It's got 6 carbons. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then it's got OHs coming off. Okay? So it's got that C1H2O1 formula. Usually monosaccharides, we can have them linear if they're just solid or they're not in a water solution. But as soon as they're in aqueous solution, or they're like in the juice of a fruit, or they're in the juice of your body, they're in this ring formation. They make these nice, pretty little rings, just like that. Do you have to know how they go from linear to ring? No, you do not. Just they're usually in ring structure in tissues of organisms like us. So they make rings. Glucose, really important monosaccharide. By the way, monosaccharide means one saccharide, sugar, simple ring sugar, or simple sugar. Did you have a question, Michael?
Yeah, so what it means by unstable in water doesn't mean it doesn't break down.
Unstable in water means it's not breaking apart, but it doesn't like to be in that linear formation. So what it does is it folds in and forms a ring and cyclizes on itself, and it creates a ring. So it's in a tighter, more stable conformation. But it likes associating in water in this form. So you'll find them in our bodies in this form, in this kind of ring structure form in an aqueous solution. So how do we make them? This is an example of a glucose molecule, 2 of them, okay, and they're right next to each other. I want you to sort of tell me what's happening here. There's the hydroxide, or the OHs, that are the side groups coming off all over the glucose molecules. They come in close proximity, and now I have a water coming off, right? So now there's, in this situation here, if we move over to the right, now we have an oxygen connected, bonded to both of the 2 adjacent carbons on the carbon rings of the previous glucose molecule. So it removes the water, and now they're holding hands with an oxygen right in the center. What's that reaction called? Think about it for a second. You've got 2 options. You've got dehydration or condensation reaction. Condensation is like rain, right? Produces water. Or you've got hydrolysis reaction. Which one is this one? Dehydration, that's right, perfect. And it's imon, right? Imon. Yes, okay, so why? Because you're removing water. You're removing water. You're causing condensation to happen, or dehydration. You're pulling off the water. And in doing so, I just made a 2-glucose disaccharide, 2 sugars, right? So now what happens to be maltose, actually. It's the 2 glucose together, we call maltose. It's a type of disaccharide. And now I can do that same thing again with 2 different derivatives. We've got fructose and glucose, which are isomers of simple sugars. Put them together and you get sucrose. Sucrose actually is a disaccharide, shown right here with this little glycosidic linkage with the oxygen bonded right to the 2 carbons. That's actually common like table sugar. This is like regular sugar that we have from sugar cane or sugar beets or whatever. This is in brown sugar and white sugar, all that stuff is yummy. This is very tasty. Okay? So these are the disaccharides. Dehydration is what's connecting those monomers to make the disaccharides. All right, so I just want you to remember, what's a disaccharide? Two sugars, two simple sugars put together, like glucose and glucose, or like glucose and fructose, okay? So it's a disaccharide. So your body would have to break that down, free those into monomers, and then use those to metabolize even further. All right, what's a polysaccharide? That's where we're going now. Multiple. So we're gonna do this times 2, times 3, times 4, times 5. We're gonna make this real long, and that's how you get polysaccharides. Someone tell me what another name for a polysaccharide is. Do you know, have you heard of like how lay people, like everybody refers to carbs, and they say there's simple carbs and there's complex carbs, that's it, okay? Polysaccharides are complex carbs, that's all they are. Complex being, there's lots of monomers all bonded together, okay? So you could put polysaccharide equals complex carbs, all the same thing, like baked potato, one of my yummiest favorite, really good, complex carbs, tons of it in baked potato, okay? So when you get to make a polysaccharide, your cells make a polysaccharide, or a plant or an animal is doing this, it actually makes simple sugars linked together. When you link them all together, in this case, here's maltose, and now we're adding on another glucose, and it's just gonna go on and on, okay? So pinching off of water each time, okay? Dehydration reactions, which by the way, you can also call condensation. Either one is totally fine. Condensation is rain, right? To make rain. So however you can think about it, it's the same thing. So these are repetitive dehydration or condensation reactions. Consecutive linkages linking the monomer sugars together. Really important in storage and structural complex carbs in plants and in animals. And we're going to talk about what types of plant tissue where we can find some of these polysaccharides, and where in your body, your cells, your tissues, do you have some of these complex carbohydrates? Where do you store them in your body for later? They have really important implications for our health and for nutrition. Getting enough, actually, complex carbohydrates from animal and plant sources. Okay, so both of them have them. We're going to go over what they look like. We have polysaccharides or complex carbs that are in plant storage organelles. So plants are storing these in their tissues. And right here are starch granules. Here's a chloroplast they use for photosynthesis and storage. These are big fat starch granules, which are basically long, kind of helical and also branching polysaccharides. Now, can someone tell me what, because we're focusing on mono, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. Take a guess of what you think these big fat polymers are made of. If I were to ask you, what's a monomer of plant starch? Like, what's the monomer? So all these are all strung together and they make these big, long, branching and spiraling structures. Just take a guess. So a polysaccharide is made of multiple saccharides, right? Multiple sugars. It's made of glucose. So the glucose, that simple sugar, that monosaccharide, is the polymer, is the monomer of all these plant storage polysaccharides. Okay, so the simplest unit, the monomer, is glucose. And what the plants do is just use enzymes to do the dehydration reaction and put all those glucose monomers all together. And they pack it, coil it up, and they store it in these starch granules. So glucose made into big fat polymers is what we call starch, or a complex carbohydrate. Starch, or a complex carbohydrate, is a polysaccharide that's stored in plants. And it's found in the leafy parts of plants, okay? Or in the body tissue of plants, fruits or vegetables. Yes, Alex?
I'm confused because you said glucose was the monomer, but it's also the polymer.
Oh, no. No, good question. This could be taken weird. Okay, glucose, let's write it. Glucose monomers, a bunch of these glucose monomers make up the actual big fat polymer. So in other words, the polymer is built of glucose monomers. Glucose, and on and on. Does that make sense? I could have written this better. That's good. Thanks for pointing that out, Alex. So we call it a starch, we call it a complex carbohydrate. It's loaded in the starch granules in the leafy tissue structure. There's a whole bunch of different kinds. The two major ones are amylopectin and amylose. You don't have to know that. Starch, plant polysaccharide, okay? Stored in the chloroplast and the leaves or the tissue of the plant. So we can digest these. Other animals can digest these. So this is when you're eating like the leafy spinach or the butter lettuce or the whatever roughage, whatever plant leaves or salad you're eating, you're getting the starch in there and your enzymes of your body can break it down. So when I say break it down, what does that mean? If I'm going from starch and I'm breaking it down, what am I getting? The monomers. What are the monomers? Glucose. I'm getting glucose. I'm getting a bunch of glucose, which is one of the simplest, easiest, quickest fuels that your body and your cells like to use. We can burn glucose. We can use it real quickly. Okay. So we're going to switch it now. Actually, we're going to focus on this a little bit more. It's the same. It's the same. It's a plant storage polysaccharide or starch. And an example here is showing this really pretty SEM image of looking at potato cells and starch granules that are stored and packed all inside of these potato cells. Okay, so here's like a big, like a white potato grown underground. You have non-branched and you have branched monomers of glucose forming these big giant molecules of starch. So when you hear complex carbohydrate, aka starch, that's what we're talking about. Big branched or straight molecules of glucose bonded together. All right, potatoes, rice, pasta, cereals, good examples of starch or this complex carbohydrate, yes? And a lot of these are good, a lot of them are yummy. Too much can be bad, right? Because you're getting an overload of ultimately a lot of glucose. Was there a question somewhere about that?
Yeah.
Yes, Allie.
What's the main difference between a starch and a carb? Because I thought they were two separate things.
No. Okay, good question. The overall umbrella for everything we're talking about, the book, and go through the textbook carefully, carbohydrates, these are all in the carbohydrate umbrella. Then we go into lipids. Those are all going to be in the lipid umbrella. Then we go to proteins, and everything we talk about is a type of protein in that protein umbrella. They're all carbohydrates. They all have the same chemical structure, and that is C1H2O1. They're just either small or they're big. Get it? Because your body can take a big fat one and break it down into the individual units, and there you go. You have the basic unit, which is glucose. Okay? Really good source of carbohydrates in the diet. You don't want to overload on it, though, right? A lot of times before doing something really big, like a big race or a big giant stamina, endurance requiring event, you want to kind of load on a little more of the complex carbohydrates. Big, long chains of these starchy polymers of glucose, you have them for access to energy. Your cells can start breaking them down, chomping them up, and you have a lot of readily available glucose that's in your blood so you can keep on exercising or performing or you're doing something major. I used to do triathlons with my daughter. We would like compete against each other. I'll tell you more about those later. It was a lot of fun. But we would sort of do stuff like that. Just eat a little bit more good protein and complex carbs in the diet and healthy fats, especially before you're doing like a giant race. And some of those races were not fun. They're like 3 hours and people are puking at the end. Not always. I paint them very negatively. They're a lot of fun. It was a good test of mind, body, spirit, and all that stuff. So, starchy foods. Lots of cereals, lots of breads, pastas, beans and nuts, potatoes, rice. Those are all loaded with starches, complex carbohydrates. Okay. The other type of polysaccharide that we find in plants is cellulose, and it's in the cell walls of plants. So not in the actual cells in the cute little starch granules or the tissue of the fruit or the vegetable or the leaf, but they're actually in the walls that make up the cells. They make the wall cells of plants very rigid and tough and waterproof and resistant. Okay? Cellulose is this structural polysaccharide. In other words, it adds structure to cells of plants, their walls. So like celery, try to eat celery. I love celery, but it's always crazy. It gets stuck all in my teeth. I'm sure I'm eating giant big strands. I can't even chew them up. I scarf it down anyways though. Some ranch and celery. Oh, I'm hungry. These lectures, I get real hungry. Even making these lectures, I'm like, oh, I gotta go get some food right now. It gets worse. You'll see the nutrition slides. Check those out. There's food all throughout there. So it's a structural, hard, very linked up, and what it is it's microfibrils, and these microfibrils are all built, all glucose, but their composition is different. So they're big microfibrils, and then they're twisted all together into these kind of ropes and then these are overlaid multiple different ways. The plant architecture and how it's made is beautiful, so it makes nice, sort of rigid, tough outer cell wall. So it's packed within the cell walls of plants. Here it is, individual glucose monomers polymerized, making the polymer into all the microfibrils that get wrapped into the ropes of the cellulose. Okay, it's got different glucose linkages. You don't have to know how they're different from the starches, but just suffice it to say they are different. The bonds, the way they're connected with the little hand holding with the oxygen, normally goes like this with two glucose molecules in a starch. Well, in cellulose, they go down and then they go up, and then they go down and then they go up, and they go down. The way they're built together, based on the construction of the monomers, is different, okay? So it's a little bit different. It's structural polysaccharide. We find it in the cell walls of plants, like celery, the outer cell wall of all the different plants, vegetables, leafy vegetables, the stalks, the stems, the rigid walls. It's indigestible by most animals, including us. We can't digest it. What does that mean? We can't break it down. We cannot break it down into the individual what? Monomers, but give me the actual glucose. We can't get the glucose out of the cellulose, the cell wall material, okay? We can't break down the glucose linkages because we lack the right enzyme that can get in there and chomp it, because of the way they're linked up, down, okay? So the base of the chemistry of this plant cell wall molecule, we can't break it down. Now, cows, goats, ruminants that sit there and chew, sheep, they chew and they eat grass. They specialize in eating grass. Grass has, on the tissue, the cell walls is loaded with cellulose. They can break it down. They have the enzyme. So they can eat a complete diet based on only grass. We cannot, because we lack that enzyme. So in other words, you guys hear about roughage or fiber, get enough fiber in your diet. This is what we're talking about. Because it's got a lot of health implications, and it binds to a lot of unhealthy, yucky stuff, and helps take it out of your system. Okay, so leafy, ruminating type stuff, vegetables, leafy greens, all this has that cellulose component, and this is the fiber component, which helps keep you regular, helps clear out your GI tract, and actually helps lower cholesterol, believe it or not, if you have enough of this. There was a question. Yes?
Do we have an
Christine.
enzyme for every food that we can
Yes,
break down?
we
So
do.
what happens if you're you don't have an enzyme for something?
If you lack an enzyme for breaking down a particular macro or micronutrient, any of these molecules, you can have severe deficits, even disease, illness, and death. There are examples where someone's lacking just a certain enzyme to break down carbohydrates, and they get neurodegeneration, dysfunction of the brain, and death by the age of 5. Some are called maple syrup disease. There's all kinds of examples. We're going to learn about some genetic diseases, actually, and ones that affect women more than they do men. But we'll go over a lot of that. Yes, that's a great question. So there's enzymes